Southern Ghost Stories, published in June 1885. It is strange that at a time when the popular taste is so strongly inclined in that direction, when the day and generation demand and appreciate folklore of every kind, someone has not collected and published the tales of superstitious fancy and the ghost stories of which the South was once so full. The period of belief in them has, of course, passed away, and it is time they were being utilized for literature. If such use is to be made of them, it must be done quickly, ere they fade entirely out of memory. From two prolific sources, the superstitions of the Negroes and the traditions of the Indians, teemed with rude tribute to the supernatural, writers like Irving or Byrd could draw inexhaustible material. Indeed, the latter found it his own best romance, if not the best which any American author has produced, upon a legend which derives its effect from a superstition shared by both reds and whites. And although the startling incidents of the story are eventually explained by purely human agencies, natural enough under the circumstances, while quite bizarre and unusual, it nevertheless owes its interest chiefly to the skillful way in which the reader is persuaded, until he nears the conclusion that ghostly influences are at work. It is scarcely necessary to say that the story alluded to is that most charming one, quote, the Gibonose, or Nick of the Woods, end quote. I cannot help thinking that he who will undertake to catch, ere they vanish altogether, and reproduce, as nearly as possible in their original dress, the stories of ghosts and witches, which the Southern plantation Negro was wont to tell with mingled awe and delight, never scrupling to believe even that which, in the ardor of narration he himself invented, will be rewarded with a richer find than even the famous Uncle Remus fables. These stories, while sometimes absurd and always grotesque, were invariably imaginative, never tame, and often appalling in suggestion and incident. When a boy, I have listened to them until my hair bristled and my blood curdled, until I would hear the groan of a spirit in every breeze, and forced at last, long after bedtime, to permit a suspension of the fascinating recital, and brave the dark night, now thronged with mysterious horrors, I have made, I could have sworn, but one long stride from the quarters to the house. I remember the substance of a few of these tales which made the strongest impression upon my mind, but I despair of giving them with aught of the effect which the sable raconteur who told them to me well knew how to produce. One which I especially relish seems either to have suggested or to have been suggested by the account of the man who, seeking to alarm some acquaintances by personating a ghost, was himself terrified by his pet monkey, which, donning a white sheet in imitation of its master, chased him ingloriously from the field. Once on a time, my oracle used to say, not such a long time ago nuther, and tullable close 'bout here, a white man ought maybe some old folks round here mut a knowed, tuck and murdered his friend, busted his head in, and cut his throat just for nothing but devilment. Well, they took that man up and tied him for the judge and the judge, and they hanged him. Well, up must know what must oblige to happen. Of course that man's spirit couldn't was this easy. I'd they hang a man for murder. He don't know of no peace. His ghost sure to keep peering around the place where they done hang him, sometimes in company of the devil, sometimes by himself. Well, that was just the way that man's ghost done. Long about midnight, hit would wrestle up one of them posts up the gallows and sit there wrapped up in the shroud for an hour or so. Sometimes hit would wrap still, like as if hit was thinking and studying, but then again hit would moan and holler and ever miserable, and couldn't tell Joe what he was saying, but he could know hit was beginning and praying and suffering, and he couldn't actually help being sorry for that poor ghost. if the man was so torn down bad when he was living, and they asked their relatives about from him what he killed. Of course, that kind of thing going on made them folks talk, and them would see hit was didn't want to see him no more, but they told about hit there was a paso of niggers what was working at a brick can that seed hit midnight every night, case they had to go by when they went to a work and come back from work, and that was often in the middle of the night. Well, they got kinda used to see the ghosts, and allowed hit never hurt none of them. But there was a spry, sassy young free nigger what had been up north and got his job and lived there in the town not far from where this ghost hinted, and that nigger said there wasn't no ghost. He keep a blowing and a jawing round about ignorant niggers believing in such things, till they sensible folks got war or with him and just up and told him to shut his head. Then it rained and wild, and white gentlemen what hadn't much more sense than he did, that he would evince them bricking in niggers by spicing the ghosts what no sure enough ghosts. So he took 'em a long white sheet one night and went to the gallows and climbed up one of the posts and sat there waiting for the niggers to come along. I lay them fool was Joseph laughing to himself about how he was going to make them niggers skip, but he never looked round to see if anything else would amount make 'em skip. Well, at last here come the niggers, talking kinda low, 'cause they wasn't kind to talk loud in the neighborhood, but was obliged to talk to some to keep up. When they come down the turn corner path, what do you see the gallows they stop. One may say, "My land Sam, there's two of them things. That free nigger, look round in. Then fast time, good Lord, right there. Not more'n a yard from him, shut the ghost. The other, Puss and Hit were leaning over towards him friendly like Hit wanted to put an arm around him or pat him on the back, and Hit was a grinding at him while the tall beef, and Hit's eyes was a man shining like the moon, but sort of smoking like the light out of a dirty lantern. Hit's face was a green and shallow white, like they colored the fat master bacon, and Hit's hair was lights twisted like witches' stirrups. The free nigger looked up at the ghost, and the ghost looked at the nigger about half a minute. The nigger was paralyzed. Then the ghost kinda snickered and saying, "Mighty insecure. Suppose you go home and stay a while with me tonight." That broke the charm. The free nigger fought and bawled, "You mount 110 miles and jump 40 feet in the air." When he came down, he lit running, and he hollered at the other niggers who was still standing in the turn of the path, "Hollin' boys, eyes on you, but them niggers just say, I want of you in the cut." That business settled the free nigger's full talk and showed what he knew. The next day, he took the marbles and died in 2 weeks. But he saw that ghost every night till he did die. 'Cause when a man puts himself in the power of the spirit by going warriors, sort of foosing himself hit, he ain't never gonna get up that and that spit no more. This idea that one who intrudes upon the proper premises of the disembodied spirit invades, as it were, the domain of a ghost actively engaged in business, becomes subject to the spirit's influence, and is thenceforth a haunted man, occurs in many of the Negro ghost stories. An almost universal feature of these tales, and one that added greatly to their effect, was the familiar manner in which the ghostly visitant always conducted itself toward the person to whom it appeared. Such familiarity, however, never breeding contempt on the side of the fleshly participant in the interview, but largely increasing his terror. I very well remember a certain beautiful forest glade in one of the most beautiful of the bluegrass counties of Kentucky, which all the Negroes of the vicinage believed to be haunted and the favorite walk of a fearful apparition. It was a clear spot in the midst of the green woods of small extent, clothed always with luxuriant grass and surrounded with noble trees. About the center of it was one of those cavities or depressions in the earth quite frequent in the region, where the soil has fallen in on the line of subterranean watercourse, and which are called sinkholes. Out of this sinkhole, it was reported, that ghosts would come at the noon of night, and would promenade about the glade until daybreak. The darkies generally avoided this locality after nightfall, but told strange tales of what might be seen there. On more than one occasion they averred an imprudent wayfarer, or one ignorant of the dangers and terrors of the place, witnessed horrible sights or heard dreadful noises there. Sometimes a sound was heard like that of a huge chains dropping out of the trees and clanking hideously along the ground. Sometimes the ghost was seen rising in pale, sulphurous flames, or striding like a sentinel about his appointed beat. All agreed that there were certain limits it could not, or seemed unable to pass, and the darky, who was caught in that vicinity, by any chance generally passed the recognized boundary himself in double quick time. It was said that on one occasion an old Negro preacher, renowned for piety and initious eloquence, was traversing this dangerous ground at the hour when the evil influence was potent. Returning from meeting, where he had been exerting his unusual ardor, and absorbed in religious reflections, the old man had forgotten his prudence, and incautiously strayed into the haunted precinct. Suddenly he was aroused from his reverie by a horrible sound of mingled groan and laughter, which chilled his very marrow, as it at once brought him to a recollection of where he was and what he had to fear. He raised his eyes, and there, a few feet in front of him, was the colossal figure of a man, through which the moonlight shone as through stained glass, and hung with chains. Its eyes gleamed with infernal fires, and it gnashed its teeth and clenched its bony hands in an agony of demonic passion. It seemed about to spring upon him. The old man began instinctively to pray aloud, imploring the protection of the power which fiends and men must alike obey. The spirit's intended assault was arrested, but its fell purpose evidently not abandoned, for it circled about him as a tiger creeps around the prey it fears to attack in front. The preacher walked on slowly, continuing to pour out fervent prayer. The ghost became more and more demonstrative and furious as he approached the confines of its bailiwick, and finally came close up behind him, and, elongating its neck to an amazing extent, actually got its head in front of the old man, and, turning it about, looked him in the face with hellish glare and grin, just when, because he said so himself, he couldn't have tucked one more step. He reached the border of the charmed circle, and the ghost vanished with a yell that rang and re-echoed through the woods like the bellow of storm thunder. The notion of a ghost coming up behind a man, and yet managing to pry over his shoulder and look him in the face, took strong hold of the Negro imagination. I have found it in other of their legends beside the one just given. A notoriously wicked nigger was riding along a country road late at night, when he spied a curious-looking object upon the stake and rider fence on one side of the road. His horse at the same moment halted, and by snorting and trembling evinced great fear of the thing, whatever it was, and refused to pass it. No one had ever supposed this spot, or any adjacent one, to be haunted, and the Negro had no reason to think he was going to be haunted, unless on the score of his general bad character, or the fact that he was then, in violation of standing orders to the contrary, riding one of his master's best horses. He described the object, which terrified the horse, and soon afterward himself, as resembling a huge scrub worm. It was white, about the size of a long flour sack, and was leisurely crawling along on the top rails of the fence. After striving in vain, by kicks and blows, to force the horse forward, he thoughtlessly swore a big oath. Instantly the appearance fell from the fence, and, wriggling like a flash across the road, squirmed up on the horse's back behind him, and sat on the end with its horrid clawed pedals on its shoulders and its head, like that of a gigantic caterpillar, thrown before his face, its wormy jaws imitating an unearthly and appalling chuckle. The darky howled, and the horse, now mad with fright, fled like the wind. Suddenly the thing relaxed its hideous clutch, dropped to the ground, and disappeared. It was a lesson to that nigger. He led a new life for nearly 3 months, and he never did travel that road again after nightfall. There ought to be little difficulty in collecting these Negro ghost tales. The old slave times are not yet remote, and so many Southern whites must remember the talks around the cabin fireplaces. The Indian legends would be less easily compiled. In fact, none of them are preserved, except as coming down from former generations. Some are very striking. Some 20 or more years ago, a lady in East Tennessee, whose bright, fertile intellect could have done much for the literature of her native South, related to me one of the traditionary stories of the Cherokees told her by some of the tribe before it was removed to the territory west of the Mississippi. It impressed me the more vividly because it indicated the existence of a superstition among the Indians in regard to the vampire, akin to that which formerly prevailed, and possibly does yet, in many parts of Europe and Asia. The belief that sometimes an unhallowed spirit is permitted to re-enter its dead body and feast on other corpses or suck the blood of the living. At a very early period, perhaps before white men had penetrated into that region, 3 young Cherokee warriors were on a long hunt in that part of the country through which now runs the boundary line between Tennessee and North Carolina. One evening, about the hour at which they usually camped for the night, they were surprised to discover, on a grassy, timbered knoll overlooking a beautiful spring and clear stream of water, a hut or wigwam of unusual size. They were astonished by this discovery, because these huts were habitually erected only in localities where some Indian family expected to make a prolonged stay, and none of the tribes had ever resided in the region where they now found themselves, but had only hunted there. They entered the hut and found it divided into 2 compartments. In the first were cooking utensils, deerskins, such as are used by the Indians for bedding and weapons, bows and arrows, etc. In the second and interior compartment was a corpse stretched upon a pile of skins, clad in the garb of a chief, and painted and feathered gorgeously. The young braves were too much accustomed to the sight of dead men to feel at all uncomfortable at having such a neighbor, and promptly determined to pass the night in the front room. So they built a good fire in the center of the apartment, and after finishing a hearty supper of broiled venison and parched corn, and smoking their pipes, they fell asleep. In the middle of the night, the man who lay farthest from the opening between the 2 rooms was awakened by something feeling about his throat. He spoke to his companions, but they remained motionless, not answering, and his quick ear caught an almost imperceptible rustling, as if some person or animal was gliding away from his side. He sat up, and by a natural impulse threw a few dry sticks on the smoldering fire. As the blaze leaped up and illuminated the hut, he bethought him that the silence and quiet of his friends were scarcely natural amid the noise, slight as it was, that he had made, and he turned to look at them. To his horror, a single glance discovered them to be dead. Blood dripping from the fresh wounds in their throats showed that they had been killed, but by whom? By someone, certainly, who could not yet be far off. The caution and self-command of the Indian are proverbial, and the young brave had these traits of his race in perfection. He had instinctively suppressed not only any outcry, but every gesture or movement which could express his astonishment and dismay. He realized that he was in deadly peril, and that his life depended upon his confronting the unknown danger with cool resolution and craft. He maintained, therefore, the listless attitude and solid look of one just ready to relapse into a slumber from which he has been prematurely aroused. After the first glance, he did not even suffer his eyes to rest again on the bodies of his companions. After nodding and gapping for a few seconds, he cast a slow and apparently sleepy but really intensely vigilant gaze around him. There was nothing in the room in which he had been sleeping to explain what had occurred, but the skin which served to close the opening between the two rooms was partially displaced. The firelight penetrated into the inner room, and as he gazed he saw the face of the corpse touched by it, no longer dead and immobile, however, but the eyes were wide open and glancing like a serpent's, while the features were distorted and wreathing with greedy and ferocious meaning. The terrible truth flashed on him. Some evil spirit, either the former inhabitant of that body or a devil, had taken possession of the deserted tenement and, by that horrible agency, had gratified its foul appetite and its malice against mankind. The warrior, as if satisfied with his scrutiny, turned again to the fire, and sat for a few minutes, with his head resting on his knees. Then, stretching his arms and yawning, he spoke, as if in soliloquy. "Before lying down to sleep again, I will go to the spring and drink." He arose, passed out of the door, and proceeded in the direction of the water. He walked at a slow pace until he was at a short distance from the hut, and then bounded off, exerting to the utmost a speed which had made him famous in his tribe. He had gained the summit of another hill some 400 or 500 yards off. When he looked back, he saw a tall figure step from the door of the hut, obscuring the firelight as it did so, and even at that distance he recognized the vampire. It halted a moment, as if in inquiry, and then sprang forward on his track, screaming as the panther does when trailing the deer. The warrior strained his lithe, steel-strung muscles as he had never done in any race before, but the tramp of feet behind him grew louder and nearer, and the shrieks of his dreadful pursuer rang quicker and closer in his rear. He had almost given up hope, and was about to turn and grapple with the fiend, that he might die as became a brave, when his eye caught the welcome gleam of a campfire at no great distance, and by a tremendous effort he gained it ere his foe could overtake him. He bounded into the circle of listening warriors standing around it. The sounds of the fearful chase had awakened them, and found them a band of his own people. Ere he caught breath to tell his strange story, he heard the spectre in stealthy but rapid retreat. The next day he returned with his comrades to the hut. The bodies of his friends were found lying just where they had died. The corpse was stretched out, as when first seen, on the deerskins, looking as composed and demure as if it had never done harm to anyone. But the Cherokee braves were not to be deceived by appearances. They were determined to take all possible precautions against any further indulgence of blood-sucking propensities at the expense of their tribe by this particular corpse, so they burned it and scattered the ashes to the winds. As might be expected, there was no sentiment save of horror and fear in these narrations of either the Indian or Negro. The ghost never appeared to warn or guide, but to hurt or terrify. Written by George M. Deverex.